As you may be aware, the general cost of living in Australia has risen over the past few years, and while inflation is currently at its lowest level since 2021, access to affordable housing, food, and essential services continues to be a significant concern for many Australians. So, in this video, we're going to talk about the cost of living in Australia and key things you need to know if you're planning to move here. Disclaimer: as we always say, your overall cost of living will vary according to different factors. For example, where you live in your state or city, your overall lifestyle, and even your household size, whether you are a family, single, or a couple. And in line with all our other cost of living videos, we'll start off with the average salary in Australia to put all these costs into context. According to the latest ABS reports, the average weekly ordinary time earnings for full-time workers in Australia are around 1,900 Australian dollars per week. I know that this may sound very high, but remember that this is average weekly earnings, and median weekly earnings are almost 1,400 Australian dollars per week. Now, knowing all this, let's get started. When it comes to grocery shopping and buying food and essential items, according to the latest reports, the average Australian household, which is comprised of 2 to 3 people, spends between 800 and 1,200 Australian dollars on grocery bills per month. An interesting fact is that those living in New South Wales have the highest spending on groceries, at 212 Australian dollars per week, whereas people in South Australia spend the least, with an average weekly grocery bill of 186 Australian dollars. Now, if you're moving to Australia, something that I always recommend doing in order to estimate your grocery bill per month, especially if you're outside Australia, is to jump on the Coles or Woolworths websites. These are the major Australian supermarket chains, and you can create your own cart by selecting the items you usually buy. This way, you can have a better understanding of how much you'll be spending. If you're already here in Australia and want to save on grocery bills, there are a few things you can do. And yes, they may sound obvious, but they really help. You can cook at home, buy discounted products, go to farmers markets, buy in bulk, or shop at discount supermarket chains like Aldi. Now, in terms of housing costs, and this is probably what most of you are most interested in, according to the latest data, the median weekly rent for a house across Australian capital cities is around 650 Australian dollars, while the median rent for a unit in capital cities is about 630 Australian dollars. When it comes to regional and more remote areas, the median rent for a house is around 550 Australian dollars per week, and for a unit, it's approximately 480 Australian dollars per week. As we always say, rental costs will vary greatly depending on where you live, including your state, suburb, and type of property. Remember that the closer you live to the city or the beach, the more expensive your rent will be. Something else you may want to know is that when you're looking for rental properties in Australia, rent prices are usually listed per week, but you may pay rent fortnightly or monthly. This depends on your landlord or real estate agency. Another interesting fact is that Sydney is currently the most expensive Australian city when it comes to rental costs, with the median rent sitting at 750 Australian dollars per week, whereas Hobart in Tasmania is the least expensive capital city, with the median rent for a house around 540 Australian dollars per week. A local housing option, if you're looking to save money on rent, is to live in shared accommodation. This means sharing a house or apartment with other people. A great website to find share accommodation is flatmates.com.au, and you can also check Facebook groups for listings. Another option is to move to areas further from the city, perhaps in the outer suburbs, where rent usually tends to be cheaper. Now, let's talk about the cost of utilities. One thing you should know is that here in Australia, we usually pay bills on a quarterly basis, but for simplicity, I'll break them down per month in this video. According to the latest reports, the average monthly water bill in Australia can range from 69 to 107 Australian dollars per month. Of course, these numbers vary depending on your household size and water usage habits. In my case, we're a 2-person household, and our monthly water bill is around 75 Australian dollars per month. But again, we live in an apartment in an outer suburb, so our rent and overall maintenance costs are lower. Something to keep in mind when planning your move. Always be strategic and consider your own circumstances. Now, in terms of electricity costs, the latest data shows that the average Australian household spends around 125 Australian dollars per month on power bills. However, other reports found that for families with children, this number can go up to around 190 Australian dollars or even more per month. In my case again, as a two-person household living in an apartment, we spend between 124 and 271 Australian dollars per quarter, which works out to roughly 41 to 90 Australian dollars per month. Moving on to gas bills, the latest reports found that the average monthly cost for gas in Australia ranges between 66 and 150 Australian dollars. Of course, this also depends on your household size and even your state. For example, colder states like Tasmania, Victoria, or South Australia tend to have higher gas bills compared to northern states. As for internet costs, such as Wi-Fi, the average Australian household spends around 75 Australian dollars per month, which is pretty consistent with what I currently pay, about 79 Australian dollars per month. This is usually a fixed rate, meaning it doesn't change based on how much data you use or how many people live in your household. If you want to save on internet costs, one thing I recommend is using your mobile data and hotspotting your devices when possible. That way, you might not even need to pay for a separate Wi-Fi plan. That said, if you work from home and need a reliable internet connection, then paying for Wi-Fi is definitely worth it. But if you're someone who's out of the house most of the time, for example working in an office or elsewhere, sometimes the most affordable option is to just rely on your mobile internet instead of paying for Wi-Fi bills. Now, in terms of mobile phone costs, according to the latest reports by CanstarBlue, the average monthly phone bill in Australia is around 78 Australian dollars. However, this generally applies to mobile phone plans where you're paying for both the phone and the service together. If you're on a SIM-only plan, meaning you already own your phone and just need the mobile service, reports show that the average monthly phone bill for this type of plan is around 42 Australian dollars. Of course, these costs can vary depending on your telecom provider and the amount of data you use each month. In my case, I pay around 30 Australian dollars per month. And as I always say, I highly recommend doing your own research when it comes to mobile phone providers so that you can find the most competitive prices and plans that suit your lifestyle. Now let's talk about transportation costs, another key part of living expenses in Australia. According to the latest reports, the average weekly cost of using public transport in Australia ranges from 39 to 46 Australian dollars per week, which equals roughly 169 to 200 Australian dollars per month. However, keep in mind that public transport fares vary from state to state, so your exact costs will depend on where you live and how often you travel. Now, in terms of car expenses, the price of fuel in Australia typically ranges between $1.60 and 2 Australian dollars per litre, and Australians spend on average around 286 Australian dollars per month on fuel, which is approximately 60 to 66 Australian dollars per week. It's important to note that these figures only cover fuel costs. They do not include expenses such as toll roads, car registration, parking fees, or car insurance. And of course, these costs can vary significantly depending on the type of car you drive, your driving habits, and the city or region you live in. Now, let's talk about healthcare, one of the most important aspects of living in Australia. The cost of doctor consultations in Australia varies depending on how long your consultation is, and whether your GP, general practitioner, offers bulk billing or Medicare rebates. For example, in my case, a standard 20-minute consultation with my GP costs between 109 and 130 Australian dollars, and I get a Medicare rebate of around 43 Australian dollars. For shorter consultations, you may pay less, and for longer ones, you'll pay more. According to the most recent reports, most GP consultations in Australia start at around 80 Australian dollars, but you receive a Medicare rebate. If you don't have Medicare, you may be covered by private health insurance, which is often a requirement for certain Australian visas. If you plan to get private health insurance, you can expect to pay on average around 60 Australian dollars per month, and if you're a couple or a family, you'll naturally pay a bit more. However, make sure you do your own research when it comes to health insurance providers. Now, let's talk about education. Your education costs will vary depending on your location, education provider, and level of study. Something you might want to know is that education inflation has become one of the major contributors to the rising cost of living across Australia, with an average national increase of 5.85%. If you have children and want to send them to school, primary and secondary school fees in Australia are influenced not only by the state you live in, but also by factors such as whether the school is located in a metropolitan or regional area, and whether it's a state government, Catholic, or independent private school. According to the latest reports, sending your child to a government primary school, for example, in the state of South Australia, will cost you around 440 Australian dollars in school fees per year. However, if you send them to an independent private school, fees can range between 20,000 and 40,000 Australian dollars per year. On top of that, you also need to consider extra costs such as uniforms, electronic devices like an iPad or computer, transport, and general school activities, which can amount to over 7,000 Australian dollars per year. For a bigger picture, a report by the Future Investment Group notes that over the full 13 years of schooling, the average cost of education in Australia, including tuition fees and ancillary expenses, can range anywhere from 80,000 to 300,000 Australian dollars, depending on the type of school and area. Generally, government or regional schools tend to be more affordable than Catholic or independent schools in major cities. Now, let's talk about childcare fees. According to the latest reports, the average cost of childcare in Australia ranges between 70 and 300 Australian dollars per day, depending on the state or area you live in. Regardless of the variation, it's still incredibly expensive. And this is one of the main reasons why the Australian government is working to implement subsidies and new policies to make childcare more affordable for Australian families. Now, for those of you who are interested in taking a TAP or VET course, for example, Let to Get 4 or a diploma tuition fees generally start at $7,000 per semester, and they can go up to $40,000 per year or more, depending on the discipline. But again, this cost will vary and will be different according to the state you live in, according to the institution that you're enrolling in, but also whether you're an international student or a local student. International students tend to pay significantly more now when it comes to university degrees. Tuition fees here in Australia start at $20,000 per year as a bare minimum, but generally tend to be a bit higher than this, especially again for international students. When it comes to fitness and hobbies, Australians spend on average between 63 and 70 Australian dollars per month on gym memberships. Personally, I pay around 127 Australian dollars per month for my rock climbing gym. If you want to stay active without paying for a membership, there are plenty of free or low-cost options. You can go for a run, hike, or cycle. Australia has beautiful parks and trails everywhere. Public swimming pools are also affordable, with entry fees around 10 Australian dollars per day, and kids' swimming lessons usually cost between 40 and 50 Australian dollars per fortnight. So, whether you're on a budget or not, there's always a way to stay fit and enjoy life here. When it comes to entertainment, a movie ticket in Australia costs around 23 Australian dollars, and if you become a cinema member, you can often get discounts. Eating out isn't cheap either. A quick meal at a food court is usually between 12 and 25 Australian dollars, while dinner at a nice restaurant costs around 50, and high-end spots can reach 100 Australian dollars per person. Haircuts can be pricey too. At fancy salons, they usually start at 100 Australian dollars, while barbers charge around 50. I personally pay about 150 Australian dollars for mine. For clothes, jeans from top brands can cost 100 Australian dollars, but at Kmart or secondhand shops, you can find pairs for 20 to 30. Now, if you want to watch more videos on what it is like to live here in Australia, I highly recommend liking and subscribing to keep supporting the channel so I can keep bringing more content for you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.